Brethren, the story of a great recovery. Part 1, England and Wales. Chapter 32. Early days at Bath. The wave of spiritual awakening which suddenly swept in, unheralded, upon the old-time seaport of Plymouth, in the year of grace, 1830, had in the course of a few swift years made its way across the land, leaving in its train unmistakable evidence of a path marked out by God. To the ancient city of Bath there came one day, exactly when, no one at this distant date can say, some divinely led person bearing the savor of those primitive gatherings of God's people. Thus was the seed sown. And though neither the name of the ambassador nor the occasion which brought about such fruitful results are known, yet there are in existence old minute books and other documents indicating that an assembly was formed in the year 1837. It is known that a house of local historic interest, still standing in the city, was for a period used as a meeting place, but the exact date cannot now be determined. It is certain, however, that the assembly acquired the premises known as Prince's Street Hall in 1845, and continued there for 42 years. In the year 1840 the little company was greatly strengthened by the arrival in their midst of John Marston, who ministered the word with much acceptance in the assembly, up to the time of his home call in 1873. Mr. Code was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, where he took the degree of M.A., following which he was ordained a clergyman in the Church of England, but, as in the case of J. N. Darby and others about that time, he left the church that he might more faithfully carry out the will of God, a fresh revelation of which, having been brought about by an intense study of the Scriptures. He was joined in 1846 by his friend, J. G. Bellet, a name now familiar to the reader, who had also taken up residence in Bath. These two devoted brethren shared in the ministry and gave much of their time to the tender care of the flock. The story of the Bath Assembly is notable because of its association with brethren whose names stand out prominently in the history of a movement, the vicissitudinary course of which we have sought to pursue. In 1848 there is an entry in the Assembly book that a meeting of guides was held, and that Captain Percy Hall, R.N., was one of the principal speakers. About this time also, Sir Edward Denny, the author of many beautiful hymns largely in use amongst brethren today, came to reside here, and his name, with that of his sister, appears on the church roll. The work at this period must have made rapid strides, for in 1848 we find nearly 300 names on the Assembly roll, and this number was maintained until 1873 when it was found necessary to acquire a second hall. This was a Baptist chapel, recently vacated, in Somerset Street, and here for 14 years there was a gospel testimony each Lord's Day evening, whilst at the same time a meeting for believers was being held in Prince's Street Hall. About the year 1875 Harrison Ord pitched a large tent in one of the principal squares in the city, where an aggressive work in the gospel was continued for several weeks. These services produced a lively interest in the neighborhood and were fraught with much blessing, many of the converts being added to the local assembly, while there were also those who joined other places of worship. These activities, writes Mr. Frank Webb, who has made a careful record of the Assembly's history, whilst demonstrating the life and zeal of the Assembly, were proving costly to maintain and inconvenient to operate, as neither hall was sufficiently large to meet all the requirements of the still growing work. The need for larger and more commodious premises became a pressing one, not only from the point of view of expense but of the efficient carrying on of the work in its many branches. The problem which presented itself was to receive a happy solution in a remarkable way. At this juncture there came to reside at Bath one whose name is written large in the annals of the Assembly, in the person of John Lindsay McLean, M.D., son of General Sir George McLean. He had been marked out for an army career. Indeed, he actually commenced it, serving first at Malta and later in the West Indies with the 69th Regiment. Whilst stationed at Malta he came under the care of the colonel of his regiment, an active Christian, through whose consistent example and personal influence young McLean was converted. Soon afterwards he relinquished his army commission in order to study for the medical profession. He took his diploma at Edinburgh, then went to reside at Leominster, remaining there until his departure for Bath in 1873. On his arrival Dr. McLean evinced a warm interest, entering into the various church activities with a quiet yet practical zeal. He very soon perceived the growing assembly's urgent needs, and at once turned his attention to the matter of more commodious premises. In 1887, largely through the good doctor's very practical interest and munificence, the Manvers Hall was built. Here Dr. McLean ministered for a number of years. Though not a fluent speaker, his ministry was marked by a high spiritual tone. He was a constant visitor to the bedside of the sick as well as to the homes of the needy ones, and was greatly beloved by all. His keen interest in foreign missions led Dr. McLean to commence, in fellowship with Henry Dyer and Henry Groves, a publication known as the Missionary Echo. This was in the year 1872. From this modest beginning has grown the missionary magazine we now know as Echoes of Service. Although several changes of name have been made in the interim, yet from earliest days Bath and foreign mission work have become almost inseparable, and to many are, indeed, synonymous terms. Dr. McLean's home call in 1906 was a very real loss to the Assembly and to that wider sphere of missionary work, which now had representatives in almost every quarter of the globe. Doubtless because of its fame as a delightful health resort endowed with hot mineral springs, Bath attracted many notable families, who took up residence in the vicinity. Thus the growth of the Assembly was in a measure due to this fact, while its influence and acquaintance with well-known brethren brought many such to minister to believers from time to time. On the home call of Henry Groves in 1891, Robert Eugene Sparks, B.A., resigned his position as solicitor to the Bank of Ulster, and in 1894 came to Bath to assist in the ever-growing work at Echo's office. Besides these arduous duties, which entailed much care and anxious thought, he ever found time to render spiritual help to the Assembly, his gracious ministry being of a kind that was always practical and helpful. The early demise of Mr. Sparks was lamented by a wide circle of friends, and his name is still a fragrant memory. His beloved widow was long spared to carry on a wonderful work for God, more especially in the interest of sisters in the foreign field, hundreds of whom will remember with gratitude her loving service on their behalf. In the closing days of 1937, Mrs. Sparks was called home at the advanced age of 94. W. H. Bennett, of Yeovil, who had for some time been assisting in the work of Echoes, whilst not residing in the city, was a frequent visitor to the meetings, where his ministry was always welcome and highly appreciated. The activities of brethren, says Mr. Webb in his interesting account of this assembly, were not confined to the city only. Many villages around were visited each Lord's Day, so that today we find quite a flourishing assembly at Corshamside and another at Box. Nearer home, meetings, the result of hiving off, were commenced at Twarton and Snow Hill, both suburbs of Bath, while still later yet another was commenced at Sladebrook, following a tent campaign by Fred Glover. It is not surprising that in an assembly whose outstanding activity appears to be the furtherance of the gospel in other lands, there should be a lively interest manifested at home. A chart hanging in the hall records the names of those in fellowship who have gone forth. It shows, too, that while many have passed to their reward, there are at the present time those from the Assembly serving the Lord in Central Africa, China, Czechoslovakia, India, the West Indies, Morocco, and Spain. It is often said that God buries his workmen but carries on the work. Especially has this been the case with regard to Echo's office, for, after the home call of Dr. McLean, those who shared the responsibilities incumbent upon this important work were much encouraged and stimulated by the coming of W. E. Vine, M.A., of Exeter. Later, following the passing of Robert Sparks, W. R. Lewis, of Hereford, was invited to give help, and eventually came to share with his colleagues the valuable work so long and faithfully carried on. With added responsibilities in the ever-increasing demands, it was felt that further assistance was needful, and later the two brethren were joined by our Boyd Cooper, of London. And now just a word concerning the vehicle which in God's hands has been so wonderfully used, not only in the publishing of tidings from afar but in creating a very real and practical fellowship in this important service. Almost from the start, the interest which attended the outgoing of the little publication, The Missionary Echo, continued, and in 1885, a larger paper with the present title, Echoes of Service, took its place. Since then some desirable improvements have been effected, particularly in recent years, so that the present issue of our missionary magazine, produced under the joint editorship of the three brethren whose names are mentioned above, is indeed eminently worthy of the high object of its mission. God has been pleased to use this monthly paper to stir up interest in foreign mission work. For, since it went forth, many were moved by reading its pages to give themselves to the work, and still many more were stirred to fellowship and helping forward by their gifts, until at the present time there are about 1,000 missionaries in many parts of the 5 continents. No record of this assembly's activities would be complete without a reference to the Missionary Conference, now an annual event and held in July each year. On the discontinuance of the Leominster Conference, the need was frequently expressed for a similar gathering in the West, and Bath appeared a very convenient centre. From the first, the divine approval was apparent. Indeed, since its inception, this gathering of ambassadors from the ends of the earth, together with home workers and a great company of others of the Lord's people, have in a very abundant measure shared the happy fellowship of one another, while their souls have been refreshed and invigorated by the congenial atmosphere which is ever present during these memorable gatherings.